Well, most of us aren't like Martha, who grew up in a Unitarian Universalist home. Most of us grew up in religious communities that told us just what we were supposed to believe. That God loves us, that Jesus died to save us, that our people are the chosen people, that God is three, or God is one, or a man, or a spirit, or a king, that some kind of behavior is good, some bad, some reprehensible. We also picked up probably what our religious community thought was the appropriate relationship between the sexes, the place of suffering in our lives, how to read sacred texts. All those things, taught and untaught, make up our theology. Even those of us who didn't grow up in a religious community usually picked up enough beliefs around the edges to also make up a theology. In most churches, most people share a theology that's similar, at least in its main points. And if a church member finds him or herself out of sync with the main theology of their church, they either put up a fuss or they change churches. Unitarian Universalism is not like that. Both the Unitarians and the Universalists, from the beginning, rejected the use of creeds to ensure theological conformity, and they embraced theological pluralism within their churches. We, the inheritors of this mostly New England experiment, therefore have options in our theological understandings, and we also have the responsibility to investigate those options, come to our own conclusions about the theology that makes the most sense to us. As a suggested starting point, the UUA, the Association of Congregations to which we belong, has a statement of purposes and principles, the second half of which is called the sources. This document recommends some places that we might find wisdom and inspiration to begin our spiritual quest. You'll see it in your order of service. Of course, it's not comprehensive. Inspiration and wisdom can be found in movies, computer games, music, and the mouths of babes. But the sources name some general classic sources of religious wisdom. This statement was democratically arrived at, voted on by an assembly of 2,000 people using Robert's Rules of Order, and then amended a few years later by 2,000 different people. So if you think UUs can't experience miracles, just think again. We've been going through these sources one at a time lately. Today we focus on the spiritual teachings of earth-centered traditions which celebrate the sacred circle of life and instruct us to live in harmony with the cycles of nature. Earth-centered traditions come in three basic varieties. Most indigenous faiths, including, as far as I know, all the early Native American religious traditions, are earth-centered, honoring Mother Earth and using the cycle of the seasons as the basic metaphor of life, which is really different from the religions of the book, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, not to mention the scientific mindset, all of which think of time and life in a linear rather than cyclical fashion. Indigenous faiths have much wisdom to share. The second variety of earth-centered faith arises from the fact that many people, no matter what their creed, are spiritually awakened and fulfilled in the natural world, and they work to match what they believe to what they experience in nature. From the psalmists, the heavens declare the glory of God, to Mary Oliver's wild geese, many people have found the divine most visible and understandable in nature. The third earth-centered spirituality is neo-pagan, the modern conscious attempt to create a religion, a religious community, and a spirituality which is earth-based, respectful of nature, cyclical in nature, and which harkens back to the faiths which were supplanted in Europe and the Middle East by those religions of the book. Most, but not all, neo-paganism is feminist in tone and proclaims a goddess as the supreme deity. Most Unitarian Universalists find resonance with at least two of these three kinds of earth-based spiritualities and are respectful of the other. 19th century Unitarian writers Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson were champions of the spiritual in nature in this country, and neo-pagans often find a home in UU churches, where their practice groups, called CUPs, or the Covenant of UU Pagans, offer programs for UUs and others interested in the neo-pagan way. UUs try to be curious but respectful of Native American religious traditions as well. We're going to talk about all three this morning and be reminded of the spiritual riches that lie around us.
Though below me I feel no motion, standing on these mountains and plains, far away from the rolling ocean, still my dry land heart can say,
I've been sailing all my life now, never harbor nor port have I known. The wide universe is the ocean I travel, and the earth is my blue boat home. Sun, my sail, and moon, my rudder, as I ply the starry sea, leaning over the edge in wonder, casting questions into the deep. Drifting here with my ship's companions, all we kindred pilgrim souls, making our way by the light of the heavens in our beautiful blue boat home. I give thanks to the waves upholding me, hail the great winds urging me on, greet the infinite sea before me, sing the sky my sailor's song. I was born upon the fathoms, never harbor nor port have I known. The wide universe is the ocean I travel, and the earth is my blue boat home.
Vacuum. We're dependent on, or reactive to, the faiths, ceremonies, beliefs, morals, and language of those around us. We're particularly affected by what we absorbed as children from the people who loved us, for better or for worse. For some people, what they're given as children always seems adequate to their needs. But most people find times in their lives when they look more critically at the faith of their heritage and either expand on it or abandon it entirely and look elsewhere for inspiration. UUs tend to be in that category. We take what we are given, what we learn and decide, what we experience in the privacy of our own hearts and minds, and create a faith. What we call the sources of our faith might better be called resources for our faith. And for many of us, earth-centered faiths and natural spirituality are a primary resource for our lives. So I want to spend a little time with the three major categories of this resource. This we know, said Chief Noah Self, sometimes called Chief Seattle, the earth does not belong to us. We belong to the earth. All things on the earth are connected, And whatever happens to the earth happens to the sons and daughters of the earth. The speech was written down in English some years after it was given in 1855. It was a response to demands by white settlers that they be allowed to claim or purchase the land around what is now Seattle, Washington. There are unfathomable layers of irony and darkened human hearts here. But what has come down to us from that day is virtually a credo of natural spirituality and the environmental movement. The sense of a connection, much more profound than an ownership, to land and earth is a spiritual sentiment which is often part of individual spirituality, but which has been lost to law, commerce, and modernity as a whole. We give dead corporations personhood and a legal life which no tree, no landscape, no animal, no matter how intelligent, loving, or conscious, may even approach. Native American and most indigenous faiths stand as a reminder of another way of being and thinking, a way which had to be discredited so that what we now call modernity could develop, and which now may need to be revived so that humanity can continue to thrive. The wisdom of these older ways is very available to us and attractive to many. Some have felt so attracted they've delved very deeply into it, studying or finding ways to experience the spiritual practices which nourished that older way for Native Americans: sweat lodges, dances, drumming, and so on. The attraction and benefit of this exploration is very clear, but it comes with a caution, which is that our personal quest for meaning should never cross the line of the privacy and integrity of others' faiths. We who are not Native Americans must be cautious and respectful when we use the fruits of their spiritual experiences, lest it become cultural misappropriation. It's all a bit hard to define and somewhat fraught, but we must tread lightly and respectfully, and if we do, there are riches here. Let me just tell you about one spiritual concept of Native American tradition which is useful to me. This is the Navajo concept of orzo, or being in harmony with the situation and possessing inner balance. This is congruent with my own primary spirituality, which is based on the Tao Te Ching, so I resonated with it when I learned about it, which was in the mystery novels of Tony Hillerman. Hillerman's Navajo policemen very much value this sense of being in harmony with things, and in the course of solving murders and soothing mayhem, they do some of the things that it takes to retain that sense of harmony: withdrawal to solitude, thought, and ritual, and repair relationships, and listen to their intuition. I was pleased to learn that the leaders of the Navajo people have honored Hillerman for his careful and respectful explanation of their philosophy. And his books, for those who like mystery novels, are one of the most accessible introductions to this local indigenous philosophy to be had anywhere. So, orzo. It's a nice word to have to label those times in life when things are flowing and going the way they're supposed to go, and the concept of being out of orzo is the opposite. Those days when we're out of sorts, when nothing's going our way, when the keys are misplaced, the fender bender happens, the teacher calls us, the spouse is snapped at, the bank is closed, those kind of days. Navajo wisdom suggests that the primary problem on those kinds of days is not bad luck in the world out there, it is rather lack of harmony in the world in here. Having a word for something is useful, and out of orzo has a nicer ring to it than terrible, horrible, no good, bad day, or got out on the wrong side of the bed, are so much clumsier English phrases which actually imply that the cause of my angst is out there someplace, whereas the Navajo wisdom, which I think has a lot of truth to it, is that they're usually caused by chaos in here someplace. So in my own mind, I use this Navajo phrase to remind me of something that I value. But for myself, I'm not inclined to explore Native American ritual of, say, sweat baths. That seems not quite right to me. Instead, when I notice I'm out of orzo, I slow down, I ask myself what inside of me is causing all this static, and I meditate. Closer to our own UU home, the nature-based spiritualities, which were popularized in this country for the first time by UU writers Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson. You have to realize that most of the people who settled this country thought of nature and wilderness as the enemy. Indeed, as one writer has said about Thoreau and Emerson, we UUs stand upon the richest theological legacy of any American denomination. That theological legacy is transcendentalism, and one very attractive aspect of transcendentalism is its groundedness in nature. Henry David Thoreau went into the woods to live deliberately, as he said, out of distracting society, in a place where he could be out of doors and in nature. Emerson wrote of the kind of spiritual experience that many of us have had, lying one day on the ground in a secluded hollow in the warm sun. All the busyness and complications of his life dropped away until all he was aware of was a sense of unity with everything. A moment like that, he later wrote, though it comes but seldom and flits quickly away, impresses us as more real than all the other moments of our life. We stood on the brink of spirit, and at the moment seemed saturated with meaning. A few days later, Emerson wrote in his journal, "Get the soul out of bed, out of her deep habitual sleep, out into God's universe to a perception of its beauty." I would say the same to you and to me. Been to the hills lately? Or to the river or to the woods? Is there a bird feeder in your yard? Do you have a place from which you can see the horizon or the trees as they change? And do you sit there? The transcendentalist wisdom is that no matter how hard it is to get out into nature, we have to make the time for the good of our souls. Third source of faith and wisdom for us might be neo-paganism. Neo-paganism is an attempt to revive the old religion of pre-Christian Europe, which was a nature-centered faith that worshipped a goddess, which brought fertility to the land, the flocks, and the people. This goddess has many names and forms and was often found with a divine consort, the god of the hunt. This faith coexisted with Christianity for many centuries. The nobles and the city folk converted to Christianity early on, but the old religion remained the religion of the country people, the people who lived on the heaths, and were therefore called the heathens. Eventually, this religion was suppressed, not only out of evangelical fervor, but because, like the Native American religions, it was at odds with emerging philosophies and lifestyles and ways to accumulate wealth. The pagans worshipped the nature gods and goddesses. Their leaders were called the Wiccans, or the wise. They were healers and midwives, as well as ritual makers. They celebrated their own holidays, which were a part of the cycle of the seasons: full moons, solstices, and equinoxes, and the halfway marks in between. Later, these leaders, who were mostly women, were called witches and were persecuted mercilessly in the witch craze of the 14th to 17th centuries. During this time, also known as the flowering of the Renaissance and the light of knowledge and arts, a dark shadow came into play. Between 3 and 9 million suspected pagans, mostly women, were put to death, often by torture. The picture that we have of witches as ugly old women with long noses, flying around on broomsticks with their black cats and consorting with evil, that is the fiction left to us from that horrific time. Needless to say, we don't have much in the way of accurate written descriptions of this faith or practice, so the practitioners of neo-paganism are having to experiment and invent. Modern neo-pagans are developing a religion which meets the modern needs of an immanent theology, to contrast with the Judeo-Christian emphasis on the transcendence of God. a woman-oriented religion in contrast with the male orientation of the world's monotheisms, and a nature-oriented faith to counter the destruction of nature all around us. Theologically, paganism is an immanent faith. It finds divinity within us, in the natural world, in our bodies, in our lives. This is in direct contrast to the theologies of monotheism, which are transcendent theologies and place God in heaven, transcending the world and all its trials, completely separate from here. This God, the transcendent God, the pure and unsullied mind of the universe, transcending virtue, knowledge, and love itself, is a, well, distant sort of fellow. Transcendent theologies locate goodness and value up there with God, away from human beings and from the earth, who are regarded at best as imperfect mirrors of divinity and at worst as embodiments of evil, impurity, and ungodliness. We are so imbued with this understanding of religion, even if we reject it, that we have come to see any other kind of faith as primitive or cultish. But it is simply another way of organizing our thoughts about the world. Secondly, paganism tends to be feminist by asserting a female force, a goddess, as one part of the divine, and often as the chief divine figure. Women find their bodies and their experiences validated. This is, of course, in distinct contrast to the religions of monotheism, which have had to choose one sex for God and have always chosen the male sex. By accident or design, a male god gives males in the culture overt and covert messages that men are better than women. Many women feel terribly oppressed by the traditional male God-centered religions, and paganism is a very refreshing change. Paganism affirms women in all life stages. As the goddess is worshipped in her three aspects of maiden, mother, and crone, women are affirmed as young girls, as nurturing mothers, as creating middle-aged persons, and as wise elderly persons, crones. This, too, is refreshing to women, whose religious place has variously been the pedestaled virgin, the maker of babies, the font of all evil, and the witch. Further, paganism affirms women's work, for the goddess is a weaver, a mother, a tender of the sick, and a midwife of all that is being born. Western images of God are images of masculine occupations. Have you ever noticed that? Shepherd, soldier, king. The image of paganism shows that women are sacred too. Paganism speaks of the calling of the holy as an evocation rather than an invocation, as a calling forth of the divine from within ourselves rather than a calling down of the divine from the above. It's a model which speaks of a religious quest as a deepening rather than an enlightening, recognizing that if we hold up the light as object, we negate the dark, the earth, the body, the womb, the night. Without negating the light, the vision of paganism reclaims the dark, the fertile earth where the seed is hiding, the unseen power that rises from within us, the dark of sacred human flesh, the depths of the ocean, and the night when our senses quicken, when we can reclaim lost parts of ourselves, which have been torn away by the assumptions of culture. Paganism, like any faith, can't really be adequately explained. To understand it, you have to participate. You have to learn the stories, do the rituals, be a part of the community until you can see whether it speaks to you. In the case of paganism, its current practitioners are participating in developing a new religion. While there are many ways of being a pagan, at its deepest, all paganism asks adherents to take on and practice an attitude that all is sacred and valuable for itself, and to do the hard work of trying out a new set of ideas, stories, and images of the divine, and to allow those stories and images to grow slowly and attain power and rightness with practice and repetition. It's a countercultural and deeply prophetic movement around us, and not for the faint of heart. As a resource of our faith journey as UUs, though, paganism especially reminds us to take notes of the cycles of nature. Not only the turnings of the seasons, but the phases of the moon. Do you know where your moon is tonight? As well as the length of the days, and the movement of the sun on the horizon. Attention to these things grounds us in time and place, focuses us on recurring cycles, balancing our Western focus on the march of time. It softens our ambition and encourages us to simply enjoy what is. All of this is a part of orzo, harmony, peace, balance. And these, in turn, are the fruits of the life of the Spirit, commended by all the world's faith traditions. Now we sing together. Please stand.